It is Awesemo MMA live before lock, little UFC 266 action. Alexander Volkanovski versus Brian TCD Ortega, and a fight card that I'm pretty excited about. Pete, how are you feeling about it?
Yeah, I like the fight card from top to bottom. I think that this is a traditional pay-per-view and kind of like an old school pay-per-view where there's a ton of notable names. We're so accustomed to the Apex with dealing with debuting fighters and a lot of unknowns. I think that we have some staple names, especially some pivotal matchups for certain divisions. So all in all, I can't wait, and I do think it's going to be an exciting fight card.
So now I have to ask, before we actually get into the fights, which individual fight are you most excited for? Because I think the general public is going to have one pretty common answer here. Not the one I'm most excited for, but how about for you?
Well, for me, I actually am really, really excited about the main event, but I enjoy lighter weight classes. So honestly, like I love watching Dan Hooker fight and Nasrat Haqparast. I like both of those guys, great strikers. So that's probably a matchup that I'm, really interested in. I wish that they didn't have to deal with so much adversity outside of the octagon, dealing with having to fly in and cut weight on such a short amount of time. But I like strikers delights, and that definitely has the recipe to be one.
So I figure what the most common public answer is going to be Nick Diaz versus Robbie Lawler, a fight that, I mean, I get it. It's this weekend over a lot of nostalgia, right? Because this does feel like when I first got into watching the UFC. We've got Nick Diaz is fighting, John Jones arrested. It's all the things that were happening as I first got into watching MMA. So I get the nostalgia aspect. Obviously, also Robbie Lawler, a former champion, but it also just feels like a fight that is so little significance of it to me. So I'm certainly interested to the fight, and I think it's going to be really fun, especially from a DFS perspective. By the way, if people aren't aware, even though it's not a title fight and it's not a main event, it is still a 5-round fight per I guess the new Diaz rules, because that's also what Nate did the last time that he fought in a co-main event. So I think it's going to have a lot of DFS relevance. But in terms of actual implications, I'm excited about. It's going to be Alexander Volkanovski versus Brian Ortega. And I think that's where we should start breaking down the fights, because it's one that's going to be obviously very important for DFS, with it being the main event, title fight, 5-round fight. And I fairly heavily favor Volkanovski to win, just based on how I break down the fights with the metrics here, where, Volkanovski lands at a significantly higher clip than Brian Ortega. 6.02 significant strikes per minute to 4.29 for Ortega. Also, significantly better striking defense for Volkanovski. He absorbs 3.31 significant strikes per minute for 6.28 for Brian Ortega. Ortega, a little inflated by the Max Holloway fight, but overall, his striking stats are very poor. However, there's also a little bit of a narrative that Brian Ortega, long time off, had a much better looking outing last time against the Korean Zombie. So I have to ask you this with Ortega to start before we get into maybe the more nuts and bolts and picks of the fight. But how much do you look at Brian Ortega's last fight, and how much does that just kind of make you throw out all the other data we have on him?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because in MMA, it's the toughest sport to get a read on fighters, because fighters are constantly making adjustments to bringing in, new training partners, new coaching staff, trying to adjust their training methods to, improve. Nobody wants to go on a losing streak and just, keep that as a steady. I will say that Brian Ortega looked phenomenal in his previous bout, and there are a ton of X factors that, you have to take into consideration for a fight. And that's why, like, metrics are good for some analysis, but we also have to take into consideration the adjustments he made with the last training camp. I do like his striking. I think that he can go back and forth with Volkanovski. He'll have to make some adjustments, because if he goes in there and tries to brawl with them, then I think that could be it could end up being like the Max Holloway fight all over again. I do really, really like that matchup. And given the price point, I basically went like 50-50 on the fight, if I'm being honest. I started to like Volkanovski a lot more. And then I watched the countdown. And it's not that I liked him less, but I do have some concerns, overcoming COVID, overcoming some COVID restrictions over in Australia, having to deal with limited training because, of all the COVID guidelines. So he has bodies around to help him train. But I don't think that Ortega's really having to deal with so much adversity with the COVID guidelines, where he's able to train with some of the best guys in the world. And we know that Volkanovski for a long time, was mixing in, some training camps with Adesanya's team and that incredible team over there in New Zealand. And I will say that not being able to be a part of that team for a very, very pivotal matchup is something I have to take into consideration. So with all that being said, I think that Ortega is a live dog. Obviously, it's a main event. So I'm actually getting to more Ortega than I thought I would. But again, it's basically like a 50-50 for me. If you want to be a safe player, then you go with Volkanovski. He hasn't really shown you any reason to get away from him.
So this is where it kind of gets interesting for me. I favor Volkanovski to win to the point where I don't agree with the betting line. I think Volkanovski should be a slightly bigger favorite. However, I think Ortega is a better DFS play because on the high end of the pricing range, there are so many guys to like his pay up options. And we have Volkanovski at 8,600. We've got the fighters who are over the 9K mark, like Semmelsberger, Curtis Blades, Valentina Shevchenko, Merab Dvalishvili. Those fighters have such high upsides, and frankly, upsides I think that are better than Volkanovski's, because Volkanovski, I assume, is not going to look to wrestle in this fight. I think what he wants to do is keep it at distance. He's going to try to outpoint Brian Ortega. And in a win, I think he's fairly likely to score 90 to 105 points, which is very nice. I don't know if that wins a GPP on this card unless he ends up finishing Brian Ortega. And for what we've seen of Ortega, he's tough as hell. It's very hard to believe that he's that easy of an out. Like, think how many significant strikes did Max Holloway end up landing against him? It was 290 significant strikes Max Holloway put on Brian Ortega. And the only reason that fight stopped is it was stopped in between the 4th and 5th round. Brian Ortega had said himself he was ready to die in that fight. And at the same time, while it was rightfully stopped, I think we have to look at the amount of beating that Brian Ortega is capable of taking. And there's just nothing we've seen from Volkanovski would imply to me that he's able of putting out that kind of output that Holloway did in that fight. So I think Volkanovski is a safe play. I do favor him to win the fight, but I think Brian Ortega just scores better in a win because his path to victory is most likely going to come potentially from grappling. We've never really seen Volkanovski on his back before. He was very briefly taken down in those fights against Chad Mendes, popped right up before ending up finishing him in the 2nd round. Where I see Ortega having a massive advantage here is with the jiu-jitsu and potentially being able to submit Volkanovski. I think getting this fight to the ground could be a little bit of a stretch because Ortega doesn't have the best wrestling. Volkanovski could takedown defense. So that's why I really prefer Ortega from a DFS standpoint, but Volkanovski from a betting standpoint. Does that all make sense to you?
Yeah, again, great points, Greg. And I understand I think that Volkanovski has a safer floor than Ortega, but I do think that Ortega has a higher ceiling. I think the finishing ability is there. I think that Ortega can possibly work towards a finish. And I will say that when I sit back and I see a fighter acting so out of character with the media and all, like, Volkanovski's such a nice guy and he's a gentleman. So genuinely, I don't think he likes Brian Ortega, especially since he had to do the show. But I've never seen Volkanovski seem so emotional leading into a fight. So you have to you don't want to put your eggs in that emotional basket, but you have to really sit there and say okay, well, what is all that about? Is it somewhat of an insecurity because of his training camp? I think that tensions are high. They don't like each other, but it's just always, it's somewhat of a red flag when I see a fighter acting out of character in one of their biggest fights.
Yeah, and I think part of it's a little bit of a put on. I think Volkanovski, I think Volkanovski, what he's really annoyed by is just the overall reaction he's getting from the fans right now. I think to him, he's like, hey, I just beat Max Holloway 2 times in a row, and everybody thinks Max Holloway is the best guy in the division. And obviously, the second fight was fairly controversial. I actually did score for Volkanovski and rewatched it back and still did. I think what kind of trips people up is just the 10-9 must system, where I think the first 2 rounds are very clearly for Max Holloway. I think the 4th and 5th are fairly clearly for Volkanovski, but I scored the 3rd for Volkanovski. But once again, those 3rd, 4th, and 5th rounds are much more competitive than the 1st and 2nd rounds, which are just blowouts by Max Holloway. So given the way that the UFC scoring works, I thought that Volkanovski won, but still it was a close fight. The first one was not really as much, but still people look at this division, they think it's the Max Holloway division. I think that's what really irks Volkanovski. So that's what I think brings out some of the emotion, but once again, just kind of guessing there. The other title fight on the card, and I want to bring this up because we get a question in our premium Slack chat. If anybody has questions, throw them in the YouTube channel, throw them in Slack, and I'll answer as much as we can during the show. But 1.6 in our Slack chat asked, how much Valentina do we have on DK for GPP, for our GPP exposure today? So let's work into that fight. And of the pay-up options, how high of a priority is Shevchenko for you?
I do really like Shevchenko. I like it because she's such a well-rounded fighter. She can mix things up. She can, have a high output on the feet. She can mix in takedowns. She can end up getting a ton of ground control. And I think that Lauren Murphy's going to be very tough. And when a fighter is very tough, you could have a boosted total because they just won't go away. We've seen fighters go in there and, they work their way back to their feet and get taken down at a relentless, rate. And I think that's what we could see in the Shevchenko fight. I think Murphy's best path would be pinning her against the cage, kind of, nullifying her striking for a little bit, weighing on her, trying to tax her, and then possibly trying to mix in some takedowns. But I really feel like I'm all over Shevchenko here. I think if I look at my exposure, I'm around 40% of my lineups just because I really do like her. I think I'm high 30s, low 40s. I just like her a lot, and I do like the upside. Even in the decision victory, I just think that she can do enough.
Yeah, so she is my most rostered pay up option on the slate. I have her in 43% of my lineups. For sure, she's the safest option on the slate. No doubt about it. She is. If you were to give me, and I know Pete doesn't like to throw out the lock word. You come right in, people are already asking who's the lock. Even Pete, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'm going to do anyway. Shevchenko, lock to win tonight. Fair to say.
Yeah, fair to say, brother. She's a parlay piece. Well, I wanted to put her in a parlay piece, but her line is just completely out of control. It's not even worth it. Like, I think I had a 4-leg parlay and I wanted to add her, and it's just like an extra $10. I'm like, okay, forget it. It's not worth it. I do like Shevchenko quite a bit, so that's why instead of getting to her for betting, you could be looking at some prop bets surrounding her, whether you think that she can, win via decision, I think would be interesting. But I think inside the distance is more likely, on DraftKings, she's a pivotal piece for a lot of my lineups.
Yeah, and I would have liked to have been higher on Shevchenko, and I kept running crunch. Like, can I get some more Shevchenko? Like, yeah. She's a safest piece to win. However, she's also, we have her projected to be 50% owned over on DK. Over on FanDuel, we have Shevchenko projected for also about the same-ish ownership. We have her projected also to be in, around half the lineups, a little bit under, split between the MVP and utility spot. And here's the ultimate issue I have that just makes it so I don't have like 70% of her. There's a lot of very high upside fighters in this price range that I want to get to. I want to get to Semmelsberger, Blade, Andrade, Dvalishvili, Daukaus, and you just kind of get to a situation where if you're playing 150 lineups, or even if you're playing 20 lineups or 3 or whatever, if you're trying to get exposure to these different fighters on the high end, you just can't get Shevchenko into all of them because of the price point restrictions. So that's kind of something that's weighing on me a little bit here. So that's going to transition me into asking you about, in terms of all the high-end fighters we have here, which ones are you prioritizing the most outside of Shevchenko?
Outside of Shevchenko, I really like Semmelsberger. I think this is a complete mismatch of a fight. I think that Sano, he's a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I thought he'd be a higher rank. I looked at his Instagram. He's only a purple belt. So the threat of him taking down Semmelsberger and possibly, capturing the neck is minimal, in my opinion. And also, if you go back and you look at Sano's regional tape, it's really not too flattering. I think that Semmelsberger has looked damn good since he's joined the UFC. He's got some decent takedown defense, some power in those hands. This could end up being a war in some periods, but I expect Semmelsberger to win inside the distance. Tyler Santos, not a priority. I think that she's going to outmuscle and, en route to a decision victory over Roxanne Modafferi. But Modafferi is very, very tough and just doesn't go away. She's like a gnat. She's pretty annoying. Curtis Blades, his upside is massive. But if I'm looking at another 9,000 option, I wish Manon Fiorot was still on the card because I was trying to hammer that line. But I think Jessica Andrade is pretty sneaky at 9,000, to be honest. I think that she can, mix in some power shots, maybe even some offensive takedowns. And, Calvillo, to me, could steal a decision, but I really feel like this is a massive step up in competition for her.
And so something else I'm going to point out about this high-end pricing range, Valentino by herself in terms of ownership, it's tiers. She's in about half of lineups. Then you've got Merab at 35% projected ownership. And then everybody else is pretty close. We've got Andrade to Semmelsberger, all 22 to 29% owned. And that's kind of a group that's all together. And all of them present different risks and upsides. But once again, the only one I don't really like here, and this is going to go to the question that we got in YouTube chat from Dave, who asked, is Andrade the best high-priced fader to fade? He's asking us. To me, that answer is pretty clearly Talia Santos. I don't have exposure to her, and I favor her to win for sure. I'm actually getting exposure to Roxanne Modafferi as a value play, which we could hit on that as well. But it's really just, I look at these other fighters here, and I just think they have such more significant upside. That fight, I don't think, is super likely to end inside the distance. I don't expect Santos to be looking to grapple or wrestle against Roxanne Modafferi. So with that in mind, I think that Semmelsberger, fairly likely to win inside the distance. Curtis Blades, massive wrestling upside. Merab, massive wrestling upside. Daukaus, high volume and good potential for a finish. Andrade, she just fights at an insane pace and always scores well in her wins. So to Dave's point where he asked, is Andrade the best fighter to fade? Here's the issue with fading Andrade. Here are her recent wins by DraftKings scoring. It's absurd.
It's insane.
132 fantasy points against Caitlin Chukagian, 100 against Rose Namajunas, 115 against Kovalevich, 146 against Tisha Torres, 142 against Claudia Gadelha. She scores so well in her wins that I think that fading her is a pretty risky proposition if you're playing a lot of lineups. Whereas Talia Santos, we've seen her fight 3 times in UFC, one very underwhelming performance against Mauro Borrello, where she ended up scoring 28 fantasy points in a loss. Then even her wins, she scored 95 and 77. So I have to make cuts somewhere. I'm personally not getting to Santos. But I know you mentioned there Semmelsberger as being somebody who you like quite a bit. I also think that he's a safe option. I like the spot for Curtis Blades too. We've seen from Rosenstrike has absolutely nothing in terms of takedown defense or his ability to fight off his back or get up from takedowns. And I think a lot of people are going to be weighing what happened in Curtis Blades' last fight against Derek Lewis a little bit too heavily. We've seen Blades get knocked out twice recently. Once was against Derek Lewis. Once was against Francis Ngannou. It happens. But in those fights, well, not the Ngannou one because it ended really early, he was winning every single second of that fight against Derek Lewis until he got finished. And against Rosenstrike, is that a possibility? Yeah, I guess, except I think the takedowns are just going to come so easily for Curtis Blades that I think he's going underlooked here at 26%.
I'm scared. I gotta tell you, I'm scared. And the reason I'm scared is because we've seen this story happen before. And I really think that Curtis Blades, and I talked about it on the strategy show, he is far better. He's the far better mixed martial artist. Like, it's not even close. Like, he is absolutely the better fighter. But the sport of MMA, the better fighter doesn't always win. And, I think that whenever you have a chink in your armor and now they're pairing you up against another heavy hitter, I think you just have to be careful. I have plenty of Curtis Blades because I think that his ceiling is, I think him and Dvalishvili have like the highest ceiling. Blades, Dvalishvili, and Shevchenko have the highest ceiling on the entire card. If we're being completely honest, like the upside for all of them is insane. But I will say that Curtis Blades is a liability to get hit with a big shot and finished. I mean, when you're knocked out so bad and in such a bad manner, you don't have to get touched too much for it to happen again. And you know what kind of threw me for a loop is when I went back and I look at Rosenstrike's takedown defensive stats. And to me, in my mind, he's got trash takedown defense. But now I look at it. Cyril Gane, 2 of 14 takedowns. Clearly not the same wrestler that Curtis Blades is. Alistair Overeem, 2 of 10 for takedowns. So I think it could be tough sledding in certain moments, and I think he's going to get ragdolled in periods of time. But if he's able to work back to his feet, I think he can land a combination and hurt Curtis Blades. So to be honest, Rosenstrike is one of my underdogs that I'm a little bit over the field on, just because I think that is a nice little leverage spot, and I still have plenty of Curtis Blades. I'm doing a 150 today, so this is a matchup that I set a group for, and I wanted to get a ton of exposure to.
Yeah, whoever wins, I think, is going to score very well. Rosenstrike's either going to get a finish or he's just going to get absolutely smashed and smothered by Curtis Blades. I don't really see another way around it. Like, there's no situation where I think Curtis Blades just stands at distance and racks up like 60 significant strikes and wins, especially after his outcome of his last fight. I think he's going to have a massive urgency to wrestle and get this fight to the mat. I don't think he's going to mess around on the feet like he did against Derek Lewis, where he didn't even, I'm trying to remember how long it took for him to shoot for a takedown. It took a very long time for him to try to get to the mat. And the other thing that also happened with Curtis Blades is he was beating Derek Lewis so comfortably on the feet that I think he was just kind of like, I could just do this and just pick him off this way. And then all of a sudden he gets knocked out and the fight's over. So I think he's going to go back to his bread and butter, look to wrestle here. But which fight I see is very similar to the Rosenstrike Blades fight is the Merab Dvalishvili Marlon Moraes fight.
Mhm.
Because Marlon Moraes has destructive power and finishing ability in the first round of the fight. He's got nothing past the first 5 minutes.
Right.
We've seen that now. You get him past the first 5 minutes, he's got nothing left in the gas tank. But we've also seen Merab get hurt in some of his fights. We've seen him knock himself out by taking down Ricky Simone and hitting his head on the canvas. So I have a little bit of concerns with Merab Dvalishvili's durability as well. And I wouldn't be shocked if Marlon Moraes is somebody who ends up getting a finish here. So I think that Moraes and Rosenstrike are kind of similar looking as just dart GPP plays, while as Blades and Merab are also very high upside GPP targets on the other side. This is a slate that I think has, a good amount of variance and GPP potential.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I have the same concerns, right? I will say that Marlon Moraes down an American Top Team, making the switch a couple fights ago from, training with Mark Henry and all the guys in Jersey, in Nick Catone MMA, now being an American Top Team, he has some more accomplished wrestlers down an American Top Team, one of them being Danny Sabatello. Danny Sabatello is a phenomenal wrestler over on the Bellator scene who ragdolls his opponents, similar to Merab Dvalishvili. It could be a great training partner. I know that he posted a couple things on Instagram with them. Take that for what you want. I'm getting exposure to Marlon Moraes. This is, to me, a very, very difficult single entry card. I think this card is more of a 150 max, 20 max type of thing where you have to recognize, liability, and you have to recognize, variance on certain fights. And, Dvalishvili, if he stands up too much with Moraes, I don't like his chances, but he is the king of pace. So with the pace, he can break Marlon Moraes. And I am still favoring Dvalishvili in the fight because of that pace. I've seen more lately. Moraes looks like he's on the way down, but be careful.
Yeah, it's just one. And by the way, I'm saying Moraes like 10% play or something like that. Yeah. I wouldn't just totally write him off just because if he wins, the score is going to be substantial. If he wins, basically his path to victory is a first round finish. He doesn't do that, he's losing. He's not winning a decision. He's not winning the second or third rounds against Merab. So to me, that's why I look at the fight that way, where it's a live underdog, but it's only really a puncher's chance. We've got some other questions in our premium Slack chat that I want to bring up, and then we're going to hit on the people's main event, Nick Diaz and Robbie Lawler. But Legalize is asking thoughts on Pierce in the first fight of the evening. So I'll start by saying that I have a decent amount of exposure to Pierce, who I'm not really all that confident is going to win. However, in his wins, it's most likely going to be grappling based. There's significant upside there. So that's what has me on him. In the one win we saw from him in the UFC, last time out against Kai Kamaka, he ended up with a second round finish, very grappling based, ended up scoring 133 fantasy points. So I like the upside of Pierce at a cheap price point, and there aren't that many cheap fighters that I really feel super confident in. So because of the upside, he's somebody who makes sense in my lineups. But are you rostering Pierce at a decent clip as well?
I think Jonathan Pierce is going to be a chalky underdog. And I think the reason is because of his pace and his wrestling. And, it's good, for good reason. I think that Omar Morales could be going completely overlooked in the mid-range, which also is interesting because he does train at a very high quality gym at Sanford MMA. He has some ever improving takedown defense. If he's able to stifle the takedowns with Jonathan Pierce, this seems like what you would call a pace up spot where, Pierce is really going to force his hand. We could end up with elevated totals on all stats. So I think this first fight is a little sneaky. Pierce will be the chalky play. I do favor Omar Morales slightly in the matchup. I think that it's not a priority fight for me, but I did get some exposure, and I'm kind of even with the field with the fight.
Yeah, and we also got a follow-up question in our premium Slack chat from Crimson Raider, who said thoughts on Omar in the MVP spot on FanDuel. That is a no thank you for me.
Yeah, it's a no thank you, right? But on that platform, you're going to have to defend takedowns, and Jonathan Pierce presents one of the best takedown threats on the slate. So I get what he's doing. I just don't know, in comparison to other fighters on the slate that have higher likelihood of finishing the fight inside the distance. I don't think that Omar Morales, he can do it, but I feel like a guy like Chris Daukaus is somebody who I would probably prefer in a given situation like that.
The problem is there's so many finishers on this fight, either that are finishers or just fighters like Jessica Andrade or Merab Dvalishvili, who fight at such insane paces that it's hard for me to envision a scenario where Omar Morales is the top scoring fighter on this card. Now, if you want to take it for contrarian purposes and say that he is, he's actually not even projected to be that low owned on FanDuel. I don't think we have him for 24.5% ownership. That's actually a little steep in my opinion in terms of ownership that he's getting. But I think that he's somebody, if he wins, like you said, on FanDuel, he could score well because of the takedown defense. But yeah. I don't think it's significant upside for him to be in a GPP winning lineup at MVP.
Yeah, MVP is a little much of a stretch. We want defending takedowns, but also winning inside the distance, and I think it's kind of one of those two.
All right, let's do it. Nick Diaz taking on Robbie Lawler, a fight these two last fought 17 years ago, and there's so many narratives in this fight, and frankly, I don't think all of them are all that relevant. But the one that does really interest me the most is, what do you make of this fight getting moved to 185 pounds? And have you heard some of the rumors about Diaz potentially getting knocked out in sparring and was advised by doctors to not make the weight cut?
Yeah, it's not that. I don't think it's that. I think it's probably something of nursing an injury, miscalculating the weight. It happens a lot on the regional scene. Well, where like the week of the fight or about 10 days from the fight, you'll get a call from the promoter where your opponent wants to basically negotiate a weight change. And it happens a lot. On the UFC, we haven't really seen this, but Nick Diaz and Nate Diaz really call their own shots. So I think they could be looking to have an advantage in any way possible, or to make sure that they're not going to zap their energy so much. But they have like an endless gas tank. So that's why I'm a little confused with this, because like a lot of fighters call the weight cut because they know that it'll affect their energy levels. I don't see how that could ever happen for Nick Diaz. Yes, it is a 5-round fight, which is a little interesting. And that's why, I think that it's a sneaky fight to target for the Nick Diaz side. But to be honest, I don't think anybody knows what the hell's going to happen. Like we have no idea what the hell's going to happen with this fight. So this is a complete, gut call of me just, relying on Nick Diaz's previous skills and his dedication to staying in shape cardiovascularly. But I will say that this is a very, very tricky fight. And man, I can't really get a read on it as far as, DFS. Robbie Lawler, I think, is being a little bit too popular in my opinion.
So here's how I feel about the fight. And by the way, I had tweeted out about betting on the fight, but here's the reason why. It didn't actually have to do with what I think the expected outcome of the fight was. It had to do with there's a lot of ways to bet on sports. And I don't think that people will necessarily take into consideration. You don't have to know the outcome to get sports right. And a lot of times I'll kind of play it like a stock market, where I kind of started to see the narrative against Nick Diaz coming once that weird video of him shadowboxing came out, and the interview we did with Volkanovski, stuff that I put zero stock into, right, but the public does. And at the time, Robbie Lawler was a -115 favorite. So I recognized at the time I could bet on Robbie Lawler now. The line is about to move, and I could cash it out for a profit in a couple of days. Mm-hmm. At no point did I look at that and be like, oh my God, Nick Diaz, look at his crappy shadowboxing. He doesn't know how to fight anymore. It doesn't have to do with that. I'm playing it like a stock market where it's like, okay, the line is about to move in this direction. I'm either going to be able to hedge for a profit or cash out the bet for a profit. And that was the angle I was looking at it from. From a DFS perspective, I think Nick Diaz is the better play here, just based on the striking metrics that we have. Also, it's very relevant to note, this is a 5-round fight, guys. This is not a 3-round fight. Nick Diaz, 5-round fight as a featured fight on the pay-per-view. We saw Nate Diaz do that against Leon Edwards recently, where that was a 5-round co-main event. But for this fight, it's going to be 5 rounds, and Nick Diaz has excellent pace stats. If you look at his striking output, very similar to what Nate does. It's just a lot of strikes in bunches. He lands 5.43 significant strikes per minute. He also lands 1.32 takedowns per 15 minutes. He's not the best wrestler in the world, but he's certainly a good grappler, as is his brother. So I think the scoring ability for Nick in this spot is pretty high in a win. And going back to, and by the way, these numbers are from forever ago. So, but it's what we have to work with. He hasn't won a fight since 2011. It's been forever. But still, we do have saved on Fantasy Cruncher the box scores from his last wins, which, by the way, once again came forever ago. His last win against BJ Penn. This was a 3-round decision win in October 29th, 2011, UFC 137. He scored 123 fantasy points in a 3-round decision win. Gleison Tebow, he scored 109 fantasy points in a win there. Against Josh Neer, 115 fantasy points. So he's somebody who scores well and wins. And the other thing also is if Robbie Lawler ends up beating Nick Diaz, I think it's going to come via one of two ways. Either number one, it's going to be a quick finish to where Nick is just, hey, he's old. He's not able to take shots anymore. Maybe Robbie finishes him early. Or if Robbie does out-edge Nick Diaz in the decision, Nick is going to bring the volume out of him. He's going to have to throw at a high pace to keep up. So I'm going to be prioritizing this fight pretty heavily just because it's a 5-round nature and how high the output is of Nick Diaz. I think that's going to force the action. How high of a priority is this fight to get exposure to for you?
I wish I probably prioritized a little bit more. Yeah, but I will say that I don't think that Robbie Lawler can really keep up with the pace of Nick Diaz. If we've seen Robbie Lawler take rounds off at a time, we've seen him shell up against the cage. He conserves his energy, which is very intelligent, but I think that certain fighters can fight certain ways. And I don't see Robbie being able to match the volume of Nick. I understand that he's had some great wars with Rory McDonald and looked good in some fights against Hendricks, but I don't know, man. I think when you're going up against Diaz, it's about pressure, and Diaz will pressure him and have him on the back foot, which I think could really work in Diaz's favor. So with all that being said, I am still favoring Diaz. I understand the elevated totals in a somewhat pace-up spot over 5 rounds. So if everything was the same, let's say 5-6 years ago, I think Diaz walks right through Robbie Lawler. But this is MMA, and it's been quite a bit since we've seen him compete. If you want to be fair, Robbie Lawler has been in the cage recently and has been in there with some legitimate talent.
Yeah, and by the way, because people are asking about the age, Nick Diaz is 38, Robbie Lawler 39. And then you also have the narrative of what matters more. Like Nick Diaz has not won a fight in 10 years. His last professional fight was against Anderson Silva in January of 2015, a result that he ended up losing, but then got overturned because of a positive PED test. But then on the other side of Robbie Lawler, he's been active, but he hasn't been competitive in a lot of those fights. The fight against Neil Magny just gets controlled against the cage and outpaced. Against Colby Covington, he absolutely, again, just got smothered by pressure. Colby Covington ends up landing 10 takedowns, 179 significant strikes. The fight against Ben Askren, that's a kind of wonky result. I actually thought, all things considered, Robbie Lawler looked a little better in that fight than people are generally giving him credit for. That was a super weird result in that one also. And then the decision loss against Rafael Dos Anjos, where I think he tore his ACL in the middle of that fight. So I think there's a lot of upside, but I think anybody who looks at this and is just super confident in the result is a little bit misplaced. I have no clue what the hell is going to happen here.
Same. I'm treating it like we have, 2 fighters we don't really know much about. That's kind of what I'm dealing with over here with my exposure levels, where, you have some debuting fighters or fighters that have been absent from the cage. They're going to look different than what they used to look like. So treat it accordingly, be very careful. But I do think that Diaz, given the price point, is a little sneaky.
All right, guys, today's show is sponsored by Prize Picks. If you are not familiar with Prize Picks, these are prop-based daily fantasy contests. Pretty fun and pretty simple. All you have to do is pick props, go over-unders, and you could parlay everything together. They've got MMA. They've got all kinds of esports. Last time I went over there, they had disc golf up there. So if listen, there's all kinds of crazy parlays you could build over there. If you've ever been sitting there, you go like, how many kills is this kid going to get in Call of Duty? How many strokes is this guy going to have in disc golf? And maybe like Nick Diaz's strike total. There's all different kinds of sports. They have a little bit of everything there. But most importantly, if you're going over there and signing up for the first time, use the promo code Awesemo and get a deposit match of up to $100. Great way to build your bankroll. Start over at Prize Picks with that promo code and start with $100 free in your pocket. All right. And you mentioned right there about some fighters who are making debuts and maybe not knowing what to make of some of them. And I wanted to address that we got legalized in our premium Slack chat. Just asked a question. He wanted to know what we know about Brundage, who's going to be fighting Maximov on short notice. And there's not that much data on either of these guys. And one thing I like about the pay-per-view cards in general is we get a lot of fighters who I don't have to look at grainy, regional footage for a lot of these guys. A lot of them, it's like, hey, I've watched Volkanovski fight 1,000,000 times. I've watched, Brian Ortega fight a 1,000,000 times. Valentina Shevchenko, Lauren Murphy. This is one of those fights where we don't have that kind of data on. I've really liked the wrestling ability of Maximov. And from what I've seen of Brundage, I also think that he's a pretty capable wrestler. I think my number one concern on this fight, and personally, I do favor Maximov. I'm a little concerned that both of them are capable wrestlers and grapplers, and they'll just kind of cancel each other out, and we'll get one of those kind of sloppy, lower pace striking affairs. But what's your take on the Brundage Maximov fight?
It's a fight I'm prioritizing because of the salary of both of these fighters, and I think that Maximov brings a higher ceiling in regards to finding a finish. He's a phenomenal grappler out of Nick Diaz's camp, and he hunts submissions like some of the best. He'll hunt leg locks. He'll really go for the kill, and that's what you want in a fighter when you're rostering him on DFS. You want finishers. But I will tell you that Jason Floyd knows a lot about both of these guys. And he told me that Cody Brundage is a very, very capable fighter and a very good wrestler. He's probably the better wrestler of the two, but Maximov is the better grappler. So Brundage is fairly priced. I think he's pretty sneaky. He probably has the striking advantage over Maximov. He's the main training partner for Anthony Smith out of Factory X. So I think it's a sneaky spot for both guys. Like I said, I made a group. I wanted to get to at least one of these guys. As far as ceiling, I do think Maximov probably finds a finish more likely than not. But I really like both of these fighters. And I think it's a fight that a lot of people could just kind of scroll past. They don't want to deal with it. You know what I mean? But you have two fighters under 8,000. I think it's, it should definitely be a part of your lineups. Greg, we got 500 people in here. We really appreciate you guys. If you could just hit that, thumbs up, get us over 100 likes. We'll keep answering your questions.
Yeah, and I think that's also something that is kind of important about the fight is you're getting a win from a low price fighter no matter what. And I don't know there's that many low price fighters, and I think we could transition to this next that I feel super confident about. I don't know that we're going to get as many fights as there are on this card. I don't know how many upsets they're going to be when I'm pretty confident that a lot of the higher price fighters are going to win. Shevchenko, Semmelsberger, Andrade, Dvalishvili, Daukaus, Blades, all of them are pretty significantly sized favorites, and rightfully so. And there's a possibility that one of the winners of that fight ends up in the optimal lineup just because no matter who wins, we know it's a cheap fighter. And that is something that makes it a fight I want to target. But talking about some of the other cheap fighters on this card, who is it that you're really looking to punt with and save salary? Not that you have to be confident in any of them, but who's making it into your lineups?
I think Ortega, that's kind of like where Ortega came into my lineups a lot. I got to a little bit more of him than I thought I would. I think that Jalen Turner's in a sneaky spot against a guy who's so aggressive. This is another fight, right? Where I speak about, creating groups over on, Awesemo.com using our Fantasy Cruncher tool. And this is a fight where I don't see how this fight isn't a part of the optimal lineup. Uros Medic against Jalen Turner. I think they're both going to go for it. And Uros Medic is going to force Jalen Turner's hand. He goes out there extremely aggressive. In Jalen Turner's losses, he's been knocked out in some pretty devastating fashion. Yes, it is against high-level competition, Vicente Luque, some other fighters on the regional scene. But from what I've seen from Uros Medic, he looks like a round one killer and can get us that, Francis Ngannou bonus. But there, that's a tricky spot because if he's only a round one fighter and Jalen Turner's a little bit more durable than he's giving him credit for, Jalen Turner's a massive lightweight, a massive fighter. So I think that he can pose Medic some problems, especially if he goes the grappling route to really stifle his offense. I've seen, Jalen Turner sparring with Luke Rockhold on the regular over at Ruka. Luke Rockhold's a monster. And you're going, toe to toe with Luke Rockhold. I think, it can prepare you pretty well against Uros Medic. So give me Jalen Turner as an underdog that I'm, pretty solidly exposed to.
Yeah, I love that fight. I think this fight is very likely to finish inside the distance. We've seen Uros Medic fight on Dana White's Contender Series, won by first round knockout. He fought against Elon Cruz in his UFC debut. That was a first round knockout. Jalen Turner's UFC record, he fight on the Contender Series against Mustaki. That was a first round finish. Then he makes his UFC debut against Vicente Luque, gets finished in the first round. Fights Kalen Potter, finishes him in the first round. Fights against Matt Frevola, a fight that oddly went the distance. I was not expecting that from that fight. And then 2 second-round finishes his next 2 fights. So these are 2 guys who are very potent finishers. And generally when Jalen Turner loses, he gets finished. So I think this is a fight very likely to finish inside the distance. Massive upside in the mid-range. This is actually the fight I think I have the most exposure to. Yeah, it is. In terms of overall, I have either one side of this fight in almost all my lineups. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah, it's exactly what I have. I really prioritize the main event. I think that the salary in the matchup, I think is nice for lineups. But I think that the Uro Shemedic and Jalen Turner fight is just a GPP special. I don't see how it's not a part of the optimal, especially when you talk about Jalen Turner possibly having the edge on in grappling.
And then on the cheap end, if we're going like super punt plays, is there anybody there that really stands out to you? I know we talked about Marlon Rice as having, a puncher's chance. Same goes for Jairzinho Rosenstrike. For me, as uncomfortable as it is, I am getting to a decent amount of Roxanne Modaffari for a couple of reasons. Number one, just price point. She's super cheap. Number two, I don't think she's very likely to get finished. She's very tough. We don't see her really get finished ever in the octagon. When's the last time she got finished? Let's see. The last time Roxanne Modaffari got finished was. I'm gonna have to go back. By the way, she's so old. I'm gonna have to go back to like the 1950s to find out the last time that Roxanne Modaffari was finished. But it's a fight that I think is fairly likely to go to decision. And just because of that, I think there's a chance that you get, 20, 30 fantasy points out of Modaffari, even in a loss. And that could be enough for her to ultimately end up in an optimal lineup. If this is a card where just look at the overall outcomes. We've talked about all the upside that Curtis Blades has, Valentina Shevchenko, Merab Dvalishvili. What happens if all those fighters score 120 to 130 fantasy points? You're going to need somebody cheap in the lineup, and there's a chance none of them win. And that's kind of where I look at Roxanne Modaffari is just a fight that's most likely going to be going to a decision. By the way, her last time she got finished, now I have it in front of me, October 11th, 2011. This is going to be her 49th professional fight. And I legitimately see a path where Roxanne Modaffari scores 30 fantasy points in a loss and ends in an optimal lineup.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, betting against Roxanne has screwed me in the past. It really has because, she's really come through at certain times. I thought that she had no chance. And it's because she's able to, overcome adversity, withstand some punches. She's well-rounded. Her striking is probably the weakest part of her game, but she's somewhat capable on the feet. And when she's getting cracked, she initiates the clinch and tries to work towards some offensive takedowns, landing on top. From the bottom, what she does that a lot of fighters don't do is she really works on sweeping her opponents. And a lot of people, you don't really see that in UFC, right? We see people get blanketed at times, whereas Roxanne Modaffari uses her jiu-jitsu to reverse position to get on top. I was actually surprised with the low amount of submission when she has, on her record, given her Brazilian jiu-jitsu acumen. And that's something where I thought that she could end up having a path to victory here against Taila Santos, because if we're thinking about it, Taila Santos in her previous fight against Jillian Robertson, I think there was like 2-3 minutes total where she was stuck in arm bars. And, she's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu blue belt, but really has a good, good Thai game, and good grappling, better wrestling than her jiu-jitsu. But she needs to really be careful in this matchup against Modaffari, because despite Modaffari really not having too many submission wins, an armbar from guard is definitely, viable here. And you're dealing with a fighter that just won't go away. I think that Modaffari gets out wrestled at times, ends up on the bottom, but she starts to implement the high guard, and Taila Santos is going to have to be very, very careful where she places her arms. So, and you bring up a point of losing fighters making it into the optimal lineup. If we were taking that approach, I would probably think that a losing fighter in the 5-round fight possibly comes through a little bit more with a total, if no other underdogs come through. So I really don't want any exposure to Lauren Murphy, despite her really, really cheap price tag of 6,700. Even in a loss, Brian Ortega in an elevated spot could possibly do well. But Modaffari at 6,900. If the top scores on the slate are the 9,000 options, the high end 9,000 options, it's a sneaky spot. It definitely is. But I think that she's more alive to end up pulling off a victory than people are giving her credit for.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is I do not think she's likely to win. I think Santos most likely wins, but compared to all of the other fighters in this price range, would you agree that she is the most likely one to actually outright win?
Murphy, hell no. Smart to know, hail to the no. Modaffari, yeah. I mean, I think it's a tie between. I like Rosenstruck because of the KO upside, but I think that Modaffari is not too far behind. If we want to bump up a tiny bit, we're talking about Cynthia Calvillo. I think that her upside is somewhat capped against Andrade. Her best path is probably trying to steal a decision victory. So I'd have to agree. I think that Modaffari is a sneaky fighter to target, and if Taila Santos is not ready for the step up in competition, we could see Modafferi end up pulling off another victory, upsetting a ton of Vegas bettors.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about Cynthia Calvillo because I've seen some people posting about her in the YouTube chat. I've seen some heat for her on Twitter where people think she's a live underdog. And, obviously UFC, I'd never say somebody has 0% chance to win, but I don't think she's nearly as live as most other people seem to think. Cynthia Calvillo, I think she's also a lot older than most people realize. Like, I don't think people realize that Cynthia Calvillo is 4 years older than Jessica Andrade in this spot. Yeah. And Andrade just fights at such a crazy pace that I frankly don't think Cynthia Calvillo is capable of keeping up with. And also, Cynthia Calvillo, maybe she's a better grappler than Jessica Andrade, but Andrade is so much physically stronger than Cynthia Calvillo that I think she's going to really struggle to control her. So Andrade, who lands strikes at 6.15 significant strikes per minute, she lands 2.97 takedowns per 15 minutes. I just think there's a spot where Jessica Andrade is going to outvolume Cynthia Calvillo, and I don't really give her a legitimate chance to win this fight. So I'm personally not getting to Calvillo today. But is she making it to your lineups?
Yeah, no, she's not. I'm okay if other fighters want to, other people want to get to her and put her in their lineups. I just think that Andrade, if you look at who she's fought the best of the best and lost to some of the best. I do think that if you look at Andrade's game and you want to poke some holes into it, her takedown defense doesn't seem to be the best. Her offensive takedowns are amazing. Her offensive striking is amazing. I don't think that Calvillo is all that good. I don't think that she's all that, what a lot of people were somewhat hoping she is. I think she's going to end up running into a buzzsaw, and that's Jessica Andrade.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, so she just fought Katlyn Chookagian, common opponent here, which MMA math doesn't really work. However, Jessica Andrade absolutely wiped the floor with Katlyn Chookagian and ran through her. Cynthia Calvillo looked awful against Chookagian and ultimately ended up losing a very uninspired 3-round decision. She didn't really try to wrestle that much, which to me, I remember that card. I don't know about you. I was on Calvillo in that spot. I was like, hey, I kind of like this Chookagian fairly low output. I thought there was potential for Calvillo to wrestle, and she just never really attempted takedowns, at least not until it got too late in the fight. So I once again, I just don't really like Calvillo here, and I favor Andrade pretty heavily. Not going to be getting to Calvillo today. If anybody has questions, throw them into the Slack chat or throw them into the YouTube channel. We can start answering some of them. We've got about 7 minutes left, then we're going to have to turn the show over. We've got so much DFS content that comes up on the channel. There's MLB live for a lot coming up after that, and that is in addition to we've already covered NFL today. We've covered college football. So you guys want to be subscribed to the channel and liking all the videos so that you know when we've got everything going live. But also want to ask you, Pete, are there any fighters that are making it into your lineup at a pretty high rate that we have not discussed yet today?
I'll say that a fight we haven't discussed at all really is the Dan Hooker Nasrat Haqparast fight. And I'm curious to see where you lay in this certain fight. If you're, thinking that this is going to go the distance and, given the price point, you don't really feel the need to get to a Dan Hooker at 8,700. But if we look at Dan Hooker's resume and who he's fought some legitimate top talent, and he has some really, really high level finishes. He's been the distance in a few fights. He beat the hell out of Ali Quenta, who's a friend of mine, Paul Felder, who's a friend of mine. And then just losing recently to Dustin Poirier, where he was winning moments in that fight and looking damn good until Poirier really, turned the tide and came back. And in a 5-round loss, he scored 98 points. And then Michael Chandler had a phenomenal debut and knocked him out. I feel like this is a sneaky spot for Dan Hooker. If we're being honest, he's the more well-rounded athlete. It's the price point that's kind of really getting me off of him. Nasrat Haqparast is primarily a boxer, and I think he could struggle with the Muay Thai of Dan Hooker and the possibility of the implementing takedowns against Nasrat, because Dan Hooker has the better ground game than Nasrat, 100%.
Here's my issue with this fight from a DFS purpose. I personally favor Dan Hooker to win. I like his metrics better. I also like his overall strength of schedule better. Yep. He's fought, like you said, the who's who. He's had an insanely more difficult strength of schedule than Nasrat Haqparast has fought. And I'm a little concerned about Haqparast's overall just kind of durability. Oh, I guess durability is also a concern for me with Hooker, because we've seen Hooker in some wars. We saw Haqparast get finished in the first round against Drew Dober and got put away pretty easily in that fight. And then also there's just the travel concerns here, where we saw both these guys. Haqparast had a death in the family. He had to fly back to Germany before coming back. Then he had visa issues. We saw something similar with Dan Hooker. He had visa issues. He had to go on Twitter to try to get his ability. I don't know exactly what the visa situation was, but he almost wasn't allowed to travel, and he had to go through Twitter to get in touch with an ambassador to be able to get pushed and get accepted basically into the country for the fight. Yeah. Does any of that impact your overall outlook on it?
100%. It's a tricky spot to target, and it's something that if you're safe with your money, you probably don't want to put $1 on this fight. If you're a little bold, then you could have a nice little leverage spot in either way. I will say that's something that we're not really taking into consideration, and Sean V brings up a great point. Are there Hooker damage? Is there damage concerns surrounding Hooker? And yeah, he's been in some crazy wars. You think about the Edson Barboza fight, the Dustin Poirier fight, just getting knocked out by Michael Chandler. Yeah, I do have some concerns regarding his damage to this point. And if you're looking at creating a group with guys that have, a puncher's chance where they have good upside to getting a knockout, Nasrat Haqparast, is primarily a striker, and he can absolutely knock out Dan Hooker. But I do think styles make fights, and I think that the Muay Thai arsenal of Dan Hooker is going to give Nasrat Haqparast some fits.
Yeah, my other concern with this fight is just neither one of these two guys, I assume, are going to look to wrestle in this fight. Dan Hooker lands 0.72 takedowns per 15 minutes, 0.18 for Haqparast. So I guess Hooker a little bit more aggressive in terms of offensive wrestling. But I think it's a fight that's probably going to take place on the feet. And then I think the winner probably lands, assuming it goes to decision, which right now the books do favor it to go to decision, it's probably going to be the winner lands somewhere around 100 significant strikes or so. And just based on all the other upside we have on the card in the upper echelon of pricing, I really think the only way that Hooker lands in the opposite lineup is with a first round finish. And then Haqparast, just because of the price point, I guess he could land in the opposite lineup with a decision win. But that to me would be more dependent on just other cheap fighters failing. So there's a lot of other fights I prefer to target today.
Yeah, you're probably going to see two fighters drained, if we're being honest. I mean, if I was on a flight that long, then I had to land and cut weight immediately, and then everything just seems so rushed. And you can be in the best shape of your life, but outside factors like that definitely take its toll. So we could be seeing a gas fest between these two where it's going to be somewhat of a low output in the second and third round, and that doesn't end up making it into the optimal lineup.
Yeah, so just a couple minutes left to go here. So can't really go too much in depth with anything else. But Pete, is there anything about this card that we have not brought up yet that you'd like to leave the kind listeners with?
I mean, I think if you're looking at somebody who a lot of people aren't going to be targeting, Abdurakhimov is a guy that is interesting given the question marks surrounding Chris Daukaus's, takedown defense and his overall wrestling ability. I know that Daukaus has solid BJJ skills, but we just haven't seen it in the octagon. That's all. Like, Alexei Olenek tried at times, but he was hurt and he doesn't really have the best takedowns. Yes, he's a phenomenal BJJ practitioner, but his takedowns are somewhat lacking. It's just an interesting spot. Nothing really I'm trying to get to. I still favor Daukaus pretty heavily. Overall, I'm expecting this to be a 700-800 point optimal lineup, if we're being pretty frank.
Yeah, and I think once again, I think it's very likely that that it's Stars and Scrubs that wins today. There are so many high-end fighters. Shevchenko at the high end, we've got Shevchenko, Andrade, Semmelsberger, Blades, Dvalishvili, Daukaus. So many fighters with big upside that I think ultimately it's going to be Stars and Scrubs. So my hot take of the card is that a losing fighter lands in the optimal lineup, and I'm hoping it's Roxanne Modafferi.
All right, you ready? I'm saying at least 3 underdogs come through tonight in the optimal lineup. I think it's going to be a wild night. I think some stuff that we did not even see coming is going to happen, and that's why I view it more as a 150-20 max type of contest. But if you're going into single entry, be safe with your lineups and just be careful.
All right, that is going to do it for us today, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and stick around. MLB Live Before Lock is coming up next.